ways that racism can show up with our colleagues and other professionals. And you have like three just very gentle, simple ways that we can challenge it.
Times I've kind of noticed quite senior managers will walk into a room and that's where there are kind of a large majority of black staff, but they will walk up to the only white worker in the room and speak to them and have a conversation. And I think we're all kind of guilty of this. You know, it's natural to look for people that look like us, that dress like us, but I think it's important that we kind of challenge this. And if we don't, what we end up doing is kind of limiting our pool of people. If we're only going to talk to certain people, it's those very people that we kind of end up promoting. It limits your talented pool, but it's also the optics. It's also what other people see, if they see that's what's going on. And it's like saying, well, going into a shop to buy a pair of shoes and then saying, well, we only do size 8s in this shop. That means you'll leave the shop and go somewhere else and they'll lose all that business. Or a travel agent saying, oh, you want to go to the Caribbean, but you can only go to Jamaica. You end up going to another island. You go to another shop and say, well, do you go to any of the other islands? And normally when I go to, one of my ways of kind of challenging this and challenging myself really is if I go out or I go to a party, I kind of always try and make conversation with someone who doesn't look like me. I try and talk to the quietest person. I seek out difference because it challenges me. But I've also got good friends who also challenge me about kind of some of my bias. They challenge me on race. They ask me why I don't know stuff. They ask me about my family history. They ask me about my relationships. So I think it's you know, if you only, I think if you only limit yourself to people that you look like you, that would create for a very boring world. And there's an exciting world out there with lots of different people. And I think difference enhances your world. It makes your kind of day brighter, it makes your life brighter, and actually it makes your day more fun spending time with people who are different than you.
I absolutely love that, Elaine. I love that sense of like there's so much joy to be got from doing this. It
Yeah.
makes your world richer and brighter. But I also love how like you are understanding and honoring why people sometimes we don't do that. We go for similarity. Maybe we're feeling nervous when we walk into the room, we go for, but actually just that gentle, mindful thing that says, hang on a second, who doesn't? You know, actually go for difference. And that's so simple and helpful. Thank you. Okay, tip number two, like, yeah, yeah.
And tip number two is kind of, you know, when you're in a meeting, you know, I've been asked to chair a meeting as the most senior person in that, in the kind of in the network. So I've been asked to chair a meeting by various people, whether that's a manager, a social worker. And when I enter the room or go into the room or on video, I go into the room and I'm the only black person in the meeting. It's particular with health and CAMS and with the police. And what I've found on numerous occasions is that kind of I'll ask a question, I'm chairing the meeting, and the other professionals will direct the answer to my white colleague who's attending with me, particularly if that's a man. And you know, when you're in a meeting and you're chairing the meeting and that happens, it's quite difficult. And I think what happens is you then become silent. And what you end up doing is what they end up, I always say, what happens is they then lose someone's experience and someone's knowledge because you become quiet, you don't feel valued. So I shut down, which means they don't get my experience, they don't get my knowledge of that situation or of a particular topic. And I remember going to a police station with a white colleague, and I stood at the desk talking to the police officer about a child we'd come to collect. and I was asking him questions, and every question I asked him, he directed to my white colleague who was sat behind me. So he had to crank his neck to look around me to speak to my colleague. And my colleague, after 2 questions, said, "Don't speak to me, speak to her. She's the one who's asking you the questions." And I think it's important that if you're in meetings or anything like that where that is happening, you don't have to be rude or in their face. You can simply say, you know, direct them to that person and say, I think you should speak to Elaine on that. They've got a vast knowledge more than me, and I think they would be more helpful. Or just say, I'm sorry, it wasn't me who asked the question, it was Elaine. Could you just respond to her answer? Because you go back to that size 8 Jamaica situation where you limit what you get out of the meeting, and actually that person might be the one person in that meeting that has a solution to the issue. It might just be that that person could move things forward, but if you silence them by ignoring them, then you lose the answer, and actually that's a waste of everyone's day and time.
I absolutely love that and really appreciate that you can do that in such a clear way by just going, look, I really want to direct you to my colleague who's actually got much better knowledge of this
Yeah.
case than I have. Thank you. And I find that really helpful. And also the point about going when when that's happening, you are effectively silencing the other professional in the room. And I'm just kind of thinking about what that might, how that might feel and how unpleasant that might feel. Um, thank you so much, Elaine. And I was just kind of, I love the next one that you're going to bring us as well, which is like when you think that something's happened that hasn't been quite right. Because sometimes in the busyness of our day, yeah, we can go, oh, let me just scurry over that. And I've definitely been guilty of that. So yeah, you had a great helpful thing for that. Yeah.
I always think at the end of the day, or after a meeting, or it doesn't even have to be a meeting, after a conversation or an interaction or an email that you've sent, if something doesn't sit comfortably with you, you know that something's not right. And I always try and revisit that. So if I'm in a meeting or if I've sent an email or I've had an interaction with anybody that I'm worried about, I will kind of pick up the phone and just say, how are you? And then say, what do you think about that meeting? How did you experience it? Um, how did you find that email? Was it helpful? Was it not? And then that, just because it's not criticizing, it's just asking somebody's point of view. And somebody might not at that time take the opportunity to say anything, but you've given them an invite, you've invited them to something, and they might email you back and say, on reflection, I found that meeting really difficult. And then you're able to say, well, what did you find difficult? Or I might say, in that meeting, I noticed that the professionals didn't answer my questions, they direct them to you. That must have been really overwhelming. Would it have been helpful if they had directed them to me? And they might say, yes, I would have found that helpful. And I'd say, well, what do you think that was about? So you're kind of teasing out the answer, and it's not a direct challenge, because I think if you go in and say, that meeting was really difficult and they weren't speaking to me, and they were speaking to you, but you didn't direct them, that just shuts people down. It doesn't help. And none of any of this challenging racism in the workplace isn't easy. It takes courage, it takes time, and it's hard, and it leaves you vulnerable. It leaves you exposed to some of your bias, still some of the things you think. But I think if we don't have those conversations, if we just sit in silence and think, oh, I don't want to say anything because I might offend somebody, or I don't want to be called a racist, or I don't want to be called somebody who's taking up the championship of driving racism. I mean, I don't want to put my head above the parapet. How do we stop it happening again? How do we stop um, how do we stop racism or any kind of
Oppression. Yeah.
discussion or oppression if you don't if you don't have an open conversation that makes you uncomfortable, that makes it very difficult? And I know that some of the most difficult conversations around that I've had are with some of my friends who have white that have challenged me about racism, where we've had kind of really difficult conversations in light of like George Floyd and Black History Month and all of those things. But actually, what we've got is a mutual respect for each other and saying we're both vulnerable, both are vulnerable in the conversation. But it's a conversation that we want to have because actually we want to make things different. We want to make a difference.
Elaine, thank you so much. That's so powerful, and I really am so grateful for you educating me, and I know that others, I believe, will find very helpful as well. Thank you so much for finding the time.
Welcome. Thank you.